Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one. Amid rustic cabins and austere looks, the tradition of homemade whiskey distillation also survived, so present that it culminated in the historic Whiskey Rebellion at the end of the 18th century. The elderly were rarely seen as burdens, even when they could no longer work in the fields. On the contrary, they remained at the center of family life, often living in the same house or in adjoining dwellings, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Their word carried weight. Young people learned to show this respect through simple but meaningful gestures, giving up their seat, lowering their voice, helping someone walk, listening without interrupting. Disrespecting an elder was not just a personal offense. It was a violation of the moral fabric of the community. Weddings in the Appalachians were events deeply rooted in local culture, marked more by simplicity and community significance than by formality or ostentation. In a region where life was hard and resources were scarce, marriage meant, above all, forming a new unit of work, faith, and survival. In the Appalachian Mountains, trees were always more than just part of the landscape. They were sources of shelter, warmth, tools, medicine, and even food for animals. Since the earliest settlements, wood harvesting was an essential activity, practiced with practical respect, empirical knowledge, and near total use of every felled trunk. Settlers learned early to recognize native species and use each according to its properties: hardness, moisture resistance, ease of cutting, or medicinal value. Trees were felled manually, with axes and simple saws. Trees were brought down with technique and planning, and rarely in large numbers all at once. The trunks were dragged by mules or horses to flat areas, where they were cut, split, or prepared for construction. Nothing was wasted. Branches became firewood, bark was used as ground cover or as raw material for dyes, and roots could be used for medicine or improvised tools. The craft required knowledge, knowing when a tree was mature, how it would fall, how to dry it without cracking. All this was passed from father to son. Over time, small mills and community sawmills appeared to help cut logs into boards, but even these were often operated by local families, sometimes with water wheels and wooden gears. Beyond utilitarian use, trees held symbolic and emotional presence. Many families built their homes next to large walnut or oak trees, which provided shade in summer and served as reference points for family gatherings or prayers. In Appalachian culture, the forest was not something to be conquered, but something to be understood and respected. Wood was also one of the few goods that could be traded for salt, flour, or tools in distant villages. Each tree carried value, not only economic, but historical, spiritual, and vital for human permanence in the mountains. Liquor, especially corn-based moonshine, held a central place in Appalachian life, both as a cultural tradition and as a means of livelihood. In an isolated region where money was scarce and access to distant markets difficult, homemade alcohol production became a common practice, passed down through generations. The base of the liquor was almost always corn, easily cultivated on the mountain slopes and ground in small local mills. Combined with spring water and fermented with simple yeasts, the mash was distilled in rudimentary stills made of copper, iron, or even adapted pots. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, especially after the Whiskey Rebellion and during the Prohibition era, Appalachian liquor became the target of federal persecution. But that only reinforced its aura of resistance. Producing moonshine was not just an economic practice, it was an act of autonomy. Many men supported their families through the clandestine sale of the distilled drink, exchanging bottles for food, tools, or even medical services. Transport was done on horseback, in hidden wagons, or later in modified cars, a practice that gave rise to illegal races that influenced the birth of NASCAR. Consumption was equally ritualistic, used in family celebrations, informal religious gatherings, funerals, and important negotiations. Although viewed with suspicion by some preachers and sometimes associated with violence and sin, liquor was, for many, an inescapable part of mountain life, a homemade remedy against the cold, pain, and hardship of daily life. In stories told by the fire, in cups passed from hand to hand, and in secrets kept in shaded valleys, Appalachian distilled liquor became more than just a drink. It became a liquid memory of a people who learned to survive with what the land gave and the government could not take away. The Whiskey Rebellion, which occurred between 1791 and 1794, was the first major confrontation between the new government of the United States and its own citizens, and the Appalachians were at the center of this conflict. It all began when the federal government, under the leadership of Alexander Hamilton, imposed a tax on the production of alcoholic beverages to help pay off the debt from the American Revolution. As a result, stills were hidden in remote forest locations, far from the eyes of authorities. However, this tax fell disproportionately on small producers in mountainous regions, such as Appalachian farmers, who depended on moonshine as a source of income. The tax was seen as an injustice, yet another attempt by the urban Eastern government to exploit residents of rural frontiers. The refusal to pay the tax quickly turned into rebellion. Clandestine distilleries multiplied, government agents were threatened, beaten, or expelled. Tension peaked in 1794 when President George Washington sent a force of about 13,000 soldiers to suppress the rebels, the only time a sitting president led troops in the field. Although the revolt was quelled without large-scale direct confrontations, the episode left deep scars. The Whiskey Rebellion not only defined the government's role in fiscal control, but also cemented moonshine as a symbol of Appalachian rebellion, autonomy, and identity. To this day, the story is told with pride in the mountains, not as a defeat, but as a gesture of silent resistance. Socially, alcohol accompanied important moments of community life. Weddings, funerals, successful harvests, family gatherings, and even informal religious services could include the sharing of drinks. Firearms always played a fundamental role in the lives of Appalachian inhabitants, not as a symbol of gratuitous violence, but as tools of survival, protection, and autonomy. Since the first settlers, gun ownership and use were seen as a natural extension of life in the mountains. In this reality, relying on one's own aim often meant the difference between feeding the family or going hungry, between protecting the children or falling victim to attacks, whether from animals or humans. The flintlock rifle, later replaced by the percussion rifle, was one of the most valued possessions for any family. It was often passed down from father to son, carefully cleaned, adjusted, and kept as a possession of nearly sacred value. Shooting well was an expected skill for men, and in many cases for women too. Boys learned early how to load, aim, and fire responsibly. Beyond hunting and self-defense, firearms reinforced the sense of independence that defined Appalachian culture. Distrust of the government, intensified by events like the Whiskey Rebellion, led residents to deeply value the right to bear arms. It was not just a matter of practicality, but of principle, relying on oneself, protecting one's land and family by one's own means without waiting for outside help. In an environment where neighbors were miles apart and help could take days to arrive, the gun became the silent guardian of the home. There was also a social and ceremonial aspect. Shooting competitions were common during community gatherings, serving to measure skill, reinforce masculinity, and provide entertainment. Each man knew his rifle as an extension of his body, fitted to his shoulder, calibrated to his aim, tuned to his breathing. Firearms were not viewed with fear, but with respect. They were dangerous, yes, but in the right hands, they were instruments of order, honor, and justice. In the Appalachian Mountains, the firearm was not a symbol of war, but of resistance. Not ostentation, but heritage. And even in changing times, it remained a deep emblem of the right to remain free, safe, and prepared in a world where life, for many, still depends on courage and gunpowder. The first rifles used in the region were the legendary Kentucky rifles, also called long rifles. Long, rifled barrel firearms that offered far greater accuracy than the muskets used on the East Coast. Handmade by local gunsmiths, they were customized to their owners. Crime in the Appalachians had a very different nature from that observed in urban centers. Conflicts were almost always resolved within the community itself through codes of honor, family vengeance, or decisions made by respected village men. The most common crimes were land disputes, family revenge, livestock theft, and violent disagreements over matters of honor. Many of these situations led to fistfights or even shootouts, especially when they involved insults to someone's reputation or transgressions perceived as personal betrayals. In some regions, family feuds arose that lasted for generations, such as the famous case of the Hatfields and McCoys, marked by decades of killings, ambushes, and mutual hatred. These conflicts usually began with small disputes, like a stolen animal, an encroached land, a provocation, and escalated into private wars between entire clans. Over time, and with the arrival of more stable government structures, crime began to be addressed by local sheriffs, rural courts, and improvised jails. Even so, the culture of personal and community justice persisted, especially in more remote areas. Even today, in many corners of the Appalachians, distrust toward outside authority and the value placed on taking justice into your own hands remain as legacies of a time when survival depended less on written law and more on one's word, and the willingness to defend it, if necessary, with blood. Natural disasters deeply shaped how inhabitants viewed life, the land, and divine providence. Although the region was not marked by major earthquakes or hurricanes, the Appalachians frequently faced floods, landslides, severe droughts, and intense snowstorms. Floods were the most feared disasters. Since many houses and crops were near creeks and valleys, just a series of strong rains could cause the water to rise violently, sweeping away barns, bridges, fences, animals, and even entire homes. Residents learned to recognize the signs: the rising sound of the water, the change in the wind smell, the quick darkening and turbulence of the current. In those moments, everyone mobilized to save the essentials: children, food, the Bible, firearms, and documents. Landslides were also frequent, especially on unstable slopes where forests had been cleared for wood or crops. With saturated soil and no roots to hold the ground, entire hillsides could collapse, burying homes, killing animals, and blocking roads. Droughts, on the other hand, silent and slow, affected subsistence with equal cruelty. Without irrigation or modern technologies, a failed harvest due to lack of rain meant hunger, hardship, and debt. Wells dried up, animals weakened, and entire families had to ration flour, beans, and salt. The direct dependence on the land meant that any climate imbalance had immediate and profound consequences. During such times, collective prayers for rain became common, as did fasts and religious vows. During harsh winters, especially at higher elevations, snowstorms could isolate villages for weeks. With no access to fresh food, wet firewood, and sick children, each family learned to survive on what had been stored in the fall. The intense cold cracked skin, froze creeks, and killed exposed animals. The elderly and newborns were the most vulnerable, and there was always the risk of death from pneumonia. In the face of these disasters, Appalachians responded with what they knew best: silent endurance, fervent faith, and solidarity. Losses were faced as part of life, and rebuilding began the next day, with the help of neighbors, calloused hands, and repeated prayer. For many, each disaster was not just a test of the land, but a test from God, a reminder of human fragility. Funerals in the Appalachians were deeply sacred rituals, lived with simplicity, reverence, and a strong sense of community. In a region marked by Christian faith, isolation, and scarce medical resources, death was a constant presence, and thus each farewell carried a silent weight of love, duty, and transcendence. When someone passed away, the body was laid out at home. It was common for the deceased to be prepared by their own relatives. Washed, dressed in their best clothes, and placed in a simple wooden coffin, often made by neighbors or by the husband or son, days earlier in quiet anticipation. On the day of the burial, the coffin was carried by community men to the local cemetery, often on a hilltop among trees where generations of the same family rested. The procession was simple but moving. After the burial, the community returned to the family's home to eat together, not as a celebration, but as a gesture of unity, a reminder that even in the midst of loss, life continued. Mourning was not displayed through black clothing, but through silent gestures and constant presence. In the Appalachians, the funeral was not the end. It was a ritual of passage, of honor, and of faith. And there, among tears, hymns, and intertwined hands, a spirituality bloomed, strong, austere, and profound, made not of elaborate words, but of presence, memory, and eternal hope. The physical characteristics of traditional Appalachian inhabitants reflected a combination of ethnic heritage, environmental conditions, and rural lifestyle. Most descended from Scotch-Irish, English, German settlers, and in some areas also had indigenous and African influences. Many had classic European features such as light skin, blue or green eyes, and blonde or brown hair, especially those of Scottish or Irish origin. However, outdoor life gave even the lightest complexions a sun-darkened tone, with thick and weathered skin. Men's bodies were usually strong and compact, the result of years spent carrying wood, plowing land, hunting, and building with their own hands. Even without formal exercise, daily life demanded strength and endurance. Women also developed a robust build, not for aesthetics, but from constant work, harvesting, spinning, cooking on wood stoves, caring for children and animals. The physical wear was visible, but there was also a silent dignity in each feature, marked by routine. In many families, especially in the most isolated areas, there were signs of consanguinity, the result of marriages between cousins or within small family circles, a common practice in regions where options were limited. This sometimes led to recurring facial patterns, genetic diseases, or very specific physical traits, such as prominent chins, curved fingers, or hearing disorders. These traits, though stigmatized by outside observers, were accepted as a natural part of the community. Hair ranged from dark blonde to brown and red, often wavy, thick, cut at home, or simply left to grow until work required a practical cut. Women often tied their hair with scarves, while men kept it short and unkempt, functional and without vanity. Physically, both men and women had broad shoulders, strong arms, and upright posture. The body was a direct result of rural life, carrying wood, lifting stones, climbing trails, and working tough soil required vigor. Religion was the beating heart of life in the Appalachian Mountains, guiding decisions, shaping behaviors, and offering comfort in the face of life's harsh realities. For these people, religion was not just belief, but a structure that organized the world. In a region marked by isolation, poverty, and the absence of formal institutions, religion provided moral order, meaning, and hope. Without established churches in the early decades, worship services took place in homes, barns, or forest clearings. The most memorable religious gatherings were camp meetings, spiritual campouts that lasted days, bringing together hundreds of people to pray, fast, sing, and hear open-air sermons. There, many experienced dramatic conversions, crying, shouting, or falling to their knees in spiritual trance. Sins were taken seriously, and salvation was a goal present in every decision. Religion permeated every aspect of life: speech, dress, behavior, and even farming. In times of mourning, war, drought, or extreme poverty, Appalachians turned to their faith. The Goins family, identified as Melungeons from Graysville, Alabama, poses together in this photograph taken around 1920. The image preserves a rare visual record of a historically marginalized community surrounded by mysteries about their ethnic origins. The hardened expression of these families echoes the immigrants who, in the 18th century, fled religious and economic restrictions in the region of Ulster. They first migrated to colonies like Pennsylvania, and later moved south and west through places like Virginia and Tennessee. The background details and simple garments reveal the daily life of families who adapted to the harsh conditions of the Appalachian Mountains, building log cabins and wooden fences with their own hands. They used natural resources like American mahogany to build homes and feed livestock. There was a vivid contrast marking these communities. Faces shaped by the rigid faith of Presbyterianism coexisted with a deeply rooted culture of armed self-defense and the habit of alcohol consumption. The simplicity of their cuisine concealed a deep knowledge of fermentation, preservation, and total food use. Nothing was wasted. Bread was made without yeast, broths used bones and skins, and pork lard was used not only for frying, but also for preserving meats in clay pots. Manual labor was the foundation of life in the Appalachians. In a region marked by lack of infrastructure, distant commerce, and difficult terrain, relying on one's own hands was not just a virtue, but a daily necessity. Each family became its own production force, building their house, making their clothes, tending the land, and crafting tools, all with resources extracted directly from the surrounding environment. Task division was not rigid, but functional. Everyone learned the basics of everything, and work was shared as needed. In the wooden cabins scattered throughout the mountains, men and women transformed natural materials into essential objects for daily life. Craftsmanship was not a pastime. It was a practice rooted in necessity and the transmission of traditional knowledge passed from parents to children, generation after generation. Men dedicated themselves to producing furniture, tools, and household utensils from local wood. Chairs, benches, tables, spoons, buckets, and even musical instruments like banjos and dulcimers were carved by hand using minimal tools. Many of these pieces were decorated with rustic carvings or geometric patterns, reflecting pride and care in their making. In times of scarcity, these products were traded with neighbors or used as informal currency. In this context, craftsmanship was not just useful, it was a form of resistance and autonomy. In each molded, sewn, or carved piece, there was not only functionality, but a silent story of effort, adaptation, and identity. Annual celebrations in the Appalachians were rare pauses in the harsh rural routine, deeply meaningful occasions marked by faith, community tradition, and strong connection to the land and seasons. Although simple in structure, these events were intensely significant and eagerly awaited by entire families, serving as markers of time, harvest, and spirituality. In a culture where most days were dedicated to work and survival, these celebrations offered joy, renewed bonds, and reaffirmed values. One of the most revered dates was Thanksgiving, not necessarily as an official holiday, but as a custom lived in the mountains long before modern institutionalization. Families gathered to thank God for the harvest, the children's health, and survival through another difficult year. Another important celebration was Christmas, observed in a discreet but symbolically rich manner. The emphasis was not on gifts or elaborate decorations, but on family gathering, religious hymns, and reading the birth of Christ by lamplight. Some families exchanged small handmade gifts like quilts, wooden toys, or homemade sweets, and sang traditional songs together such as Silent Night and Joy to the World. These celebrations, though devoid of luxury, carried deep emotional weight. They were marked by prayers, laughter, singing, and collective effort. There were also festivities tied to the agricultural cycle, such as end-of-harvest celebrations, which varied by region. On these occasions, neighbors gathered to share food, dance to banjo and fiddle music, and participate in games like sack races or shooting contests. Traditional Appalachian houses were simple, sturdy constructions, deeply rooted in the mountain environment. Almost all was made with local materials and built by the residents themselves or with the help of neighbors. These homes reflected a culture based on self-sufficiency, practicality, and community spirit. There was no luxury or ornamentation. Every wall, every shingle, every stone had a precise function to protect the family from cold, rain, animals, and isolation. When possible, a second room or a covered porch was added, serving as a sewing area, storage space, or a place to rest during summer. The floor, at first, was hard-packed dirt, but over time families covered it with wooden boards or stones. The fireplace was the center of the house, used for heating, cooking, and lighting. In many homes, the chimney was built with local stones, hand-shaped and sealed with clay. The first homes were generally log cabins made with felled trees cut and notched by hand. The logs were stacked horizontally and joined at the corners with dovetail joints, sealed with clay, mud, or moss to block the gaps. The roof was sloped, covered with wooden planks, thick tree bark, or handmade shingles, ensuring rainwater runoff and protection from snow. Many houses kept a water basin at the entrance to wash hands or feet after work in the fields. Around the house, there were sheds, barns, fences, and gardens, all also built with local wood. The yard was a living part of the home. It included the chicken coop, clothes drying area, stacked firewood, and herbs planted near the door. The houses were small, often with 1 or 2 rooms divided by curtains or boards. The main area served as kitchen, living room, and bedroom at once. Wooden beds with straw mattresses, handmade quilts, and rustic furniture completed the interior. Over time, some more prosperous families expanded their homes with wood milled locally, adding front porches, raised floors, and exterior paint. Even so, the aesthetic remained simple and functional. More than shelter, the home was a space of memory, resistance, and affection. It was where people prayed, were born, mourned the dead, and told stories by the firelight. Every mark on the wall, every crooked board, every patch on the roof carried a piece of life from those who learned to build the essential with the minimum. Traditional Appalachian furniture was simple, sturdy, and almost always handmade with materials found in the region. In a context of self-sufficiency and scarce resources, furniture was not a luxury item, but a practical object, built with purpose and passed down through generations. Most pieces were made with local wood, and each type was chosen based on its durability. The most common furniture included solid wood rectangular tables, chairs with straight backs made with slats, and seats woven from straw. Rocking chairs were a symbol of comfort, made with light wood and simple curves. They were placed beside the fireplace or on porches where elders would sit to sew, read the Bible, or tell stories. A kitchen cupboard was an indispensable item, used to store dishes, cast iron pans, ceramic pots, and utensils. Many also had open shelves to hold religious books, jars of herbs, or items of sentimental value. Furniture was generally made by the family's father, by a skilled neighbor, or by local craftsmen who exchanged their work for food or services. Hand tools like saws, chisels, planes, and hammers were enough. More than utilitarian, furniture in the Appalachians was a witness to family life. Each hand-sawn board, each joint fitted without nails, each imperfection told a story of effort, care, and continuity. Even today, many of these pieces survive intact, preserved as heirlooms, not for their aesthetic value, but because they carry in their fibers the memory of those who lived, worked, dreamed, and endured among the mountains. In the photograph, we see a family descended from immigrants from the border region between Scotland and Northern Ireland, who became a dominant presence in the early settlements of the Appalachian Mountains. The scene depicted in the photograph reveals the intimacy between the first inhabitants of the Appalachian Mountains and the surrounding nature. In the background, the rustic setting suggests a life shaped by the land. They fed on chestnuts and, in small plots, cultivated corn, beans, and squash, while hunting deer, wild turkeys, and even bears. The image portrays a family whose firm expression and simple surroundings reveal the deep values of the early settlers of the Appalachian Mountains. They valued autonomy above all and lived in decentralized communities where mutual support existed, but each family maintained a strong sense of self-sufficiency, personal honor, and direct responsibility for their land and destiny. Appalachian musical culture is one of the most vivid and authentic expressions of inherited tradition, combined with African and indigenous influences that, over time, shaped a unique style deeply connected to mountain life. For these isolated peoples, music was more than entertainment. It was a way to preserve memory, ease the burden of routine, and celebrate togetherness during gatherings, worship, or work. In conversations among themselves, one could hear the emergence of Appalachian English, a dialect that blended British English with the southern United States accent, forming a unique linguistic identity deeply rooted in the region depicted. This way of life, shaped by centuries of survival in inhospitable regions, made animals an integral part of Appalachian culture, not just as a source of food, but as part of daily life, work, and even local storytelling. The ability to care for animals, understand their cycles, and use them wisely was passed down from generation to generation, consolidating a tradition of rustic yet extremely efficient animal management. The cuisine of the early Appalachian settlers was born out of necessity, but evolved into a rich expression of human adaptation to the wild. With limited access to refined ingredients and no nearby markets, families prepared their food with what they could plant, hunt, raise, or trade. In Appalachian communities, large families were the norm, not the exception. Having many children was not just a cultural or religious choice, but a practical necessity. Life in the mountains required constant work, planting, harvesting, tending animals, chopping wood, building, repairing, and protecting. Every pair of hands counted. The absence of nearby schools and the difficulty of travel meant that many families educated their children at home, or in some cases, only taught them the basics: reading, writing, and arithmetic, so they could handle contracts, religious records, or trade. Large families also formed support networks. Marriages among neighbors, seed exchanges, help with harvests, or the construction of new cabins became community events, reinforcing bonds of solidarity. Although life was hard, the extended family structure offered a kind of protection. Having many children was a way to ensure not only continuity, but resilience. Children began helping with simple tasks from a very young age, and as they grew, they became essential to the family's survival. The sense of collectivity was profound. Older siblings cared for younger ones, and responsibility was shared naturally as part of character formation. Community gatherings, though simple, held great meaning. Sunday religious meetings, wedding celebrations, successful harvests, or even funerals became occasions to bring the neighborhood together, share stories, sing, dance, and renew bonds. Mountain isolation also created a culture of independence, where each person was valued for what they knew how to do. Blacksmiths, midwives, carpenters, weavers, healers. But this independence did not generate cold individualism. Rather, a sense of mutual respect based on usefulness, reputation, and honor. This communal cohesion sustained the Appalachians for generations. Even with all the hardships, there was strength in unity, beauty in simplicity, and dignity in the way these families cared for one another. In the absence of the state, it was the community that built, taught, healed, and protected. Hay played a vital role in the life of Appalachian settlers, especially during the long and harsh winters when feeding cattle and other animals depended almost entirely on what had been stored during the warmer months. The family was the cornerstone of life in the Appalachian Mountains, functioning as an economic, social, and spiritual unit in an environment where the community was small and the state virtually absent. More than a blood bond, the family structure was a survival pact. Parents, children, grandparents, and uncles lived together or nearby, working side by side, sharing tasks, food, and responsibilities. The concept of extended family was common, and everyone participated in raising the children, caring for the sick, and maintaining the property. Children began working from an early age. Boys accompanied their fathers in the fields, on hunts, or chopping wood, while girls learned from their mothers how to cook, spin, care for younger siblings, and keep the house in order. The father was generally seen as the head of the household, responsible for providing, protecting, and holding moral authority. Values like faith, honor, hard work, and autonomy were passed on more through daily example than words. There was no separation between daily life and education. Life was the school. The mother managed the home, raised the children, sewed, cared for small animals, harvested and prepared food, but often also helped with farm tasks, especially during harvest or in times of crisis. Respect for elders was one of the most solid moral pillars of Appalachian culture, taught from an early age as a fundamental part of children's upbringing. In a world where oral tradition was the main form of learning, elders held the role of memory keepers, advisors, and transmitters of practical wisdom. Subsistence farming was the foundation of economic life. Families grew corn, beans, sweet potatoes, squash, and vegetables on small plots adapted to the mountain slopes. Everything was done manually with hoes, sickles, and plows pulled by oxen or mules. Livestock complemented agriculture. Pigs were the most common, as they could feed themselves in the forest, eating roots and nuts. Dairy cows, goats, chickens, and mules were also part of the routine. In times of crisis, community work parties were organized, where everyone helped with harvests, cabin construction, or food transport. Thus, work in the Appalachians was not divided by formal categories, but by necessity, skill, and collective spirit. Baptism and the care of children held a deeply symbolic and spiritual place in Appalachian life, reflecting both traditional Christian values and the practical reality of a life marked by hardship and faith. Baptism in the mountains was almost always conducted outdoors, in creeks, lakes, or even improvised tubs in homes when weather prevented outdoor ceremonies. Baptist, Methodist, or local preachers conducted the rite with simplicity, emotion, and solemnity. From a very early age, children learned that life was hard, but also full of meaning. Being a child in the mountains did not mean being isolated from work or faith, but growing up within a cycle where every gesture, every teaching, and every task carried weight and purpose. Childhood began with simplicity: handmade wooden toys, cloth dolls sewn by mothers, games of running through the woods, sliding down hillsides, or swimming in cold creeks. Imagination was fed by what surrounded them. At the same time, work was part of daily life from early on. Boys accompanied their fathers in the fields, chopping wood and hunting. Girls helped care for younger siblings, washed clothes in the creek, gathered fruit, and learned to cook on wood stoves. These tasks were not seen as punishment, but as natural learning, a silent passage from childhood to maturity. Play and work coexisted, and each son or daughter knew they contributed to everyone's well-being. Formal education, when available, occurred in one-room rural schools where one teacher taught several ages at once. But many learned at home, from older siblings, or directly from the Bible. Knowing how to read, count, and write your name was enough to handle contracts, prayers, and letters.